Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HAI Research Seminar. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Deep Ganguly. I'm the Director of Research at HAI, and I'll be moderating the question-answer session at the end of today's seminar. To ask questions, please visit the HAI Events Hub and click Join the Conversation on today's talk. I think you also may have seen a QR code in one of the slides as well earlier. There it is, so you can point your phone at that. And I will be monitoring the Slido app for those questions throughout. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jeannette Bohg. Jeannette is a professor for robotics and part of the Stanford AI lab within the computer science department of Stanford University. She also directs the Interactive Perception and Robot Learning Lab, and her research focuses on the intersection of robotics, machine learning, and computer vision. And we're just so thankful to have her today to tell us more about her work. And without further ado, Jeannette, please take it away.
Right. Thank you very much Deep for the kind introduction. Welcome to my talk, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this HAI weekly seminar. I hope you can see my slides. I just want to start with the statement that humans are just incredible at manipulation tasks. And this is something that I think you really only understand once you try giving robots the same ability. It is fairly unclear what the underlying principles of this ability are, both in execution and actually learning these skills. And it is even more unclear how these principles can be transferred to robots that have a completely different embodiment. So today in this talk, I want to take a closer look at two principles that we find in human learning. The first one is scaffolding, and the second one is learning from demonstrations. And specifically today, I want to take a look if and how these principles can be transferred to robots for making them more skillful at manipulation tasks. So let me get started talking about physical scaffolding for skill learning. And maybe first of all, I want to talk a bit about a very important concept for motion generation in robotics that is called motion planning. It is, for example, used in autonomous driving to plan a route for a car and avoid all the other traffic participants. In this case, you have to control 3 degrees of freedom, position, and orientation. Motion planning is, of course, also used in manipulation for planning any kind of collision-free motions of robot arms, as for example shown here in the small video. And in this case, you have to control 7 degrees of freedom, which of course increases the search space a lot for such a viable motion. And even more complex, consider mobile manipulation, for example, in a domestic setting where you have to do both, plan the motion of the arm and of the mobile base. And it's an even bigger or higher dimensional configuration space. So it's a pretty complex problem, but we do have very good algorithms to make all this viable. However, at the core of motion planning, the way it is defined is to avoid contact by all means. And of course, this makes a lot of sense for certain scenarios, for example, for autonomous driving, right? That's super important. But it actually doesn't make a lot of sense for manipulation tasks. So here you see some examples of 3 manipulation tasks that require really accurate motions for being successful while constantly being in contact. And learning these skills for a robot is extremely hard from scratch. And learning these skills becomes even harder if you think about them as having to avoid contact. So as it turns out, humans are actually not avoiding the environment when manipulating objects. They are, in fact, explicitly exploiting it. So here's an example from Julia Child chopping potatoes. And this video was introduced to the robotics community by Matt Mason. And you can just see like how she is using her knuckles to guide the knife and to constrain the motion of this knife. And of course, how she's also using the surface and everything. She cuts the potato to make it not wobble around and everything. And there are other examples, for example, for clever designs that help manipulation. So here you have an ATM that often has a funnel around the card slot to ease this insertion motion. So humans really explicitly construct environmental constraints to ease various tasks. So here are more examples, right? So for example, humans use scaffolds to temporarily support materials and get access to height and areas. And parents use training wheels to help their children learn how to ride bicycles. And in industry, fixtures are used to help manipulation or manufacturing procedures. So the idea of motion planning, when it is defined as avoiding contact, seems not useful for complex manipulation tasks, where, at least for humans, exploiting contact is very helpful. And in fact, there have been multiple groups that have already shown that robots benefit from exploiting contact. So here, for example, on the top, you see an example from Alberto Rodriguez group at MIT, where they use planning or motion planning, but they explicitly plan through contact to reorient an object in the hand. Also, there are many groups who have developed soft hands that make it easy and very make it basically easy to get in touch with the environment without destroying the robot, because the soft material naturally complies to the environment and to the object. And then in the bottom right, you see a set of videos from the DARPA Arm Challenge from one of the teams that made it to the next stage. And you see how the strategies that they use to actually pick up these robots, they are often explicitly getting in touch with the environment to kind of cage the object. So, however, all of these works that I show here, they often design how the environment can be exploited and even they fix the environment, and thereby the behavior that the robot shows is kind of predetermined. And in my group, we were wondering, like, can we enable the robot to discover how it can alter the environment so that manipulation learning actually becomes easier for it? So just to visualize this a little bit more, here's an example of how a correct placement of an environmental constraint helps a robot. So this is an example of peg insertion, which is really pretty hard because there's like very little space between the peg and the hole. So you really have to be quite accurate. But if you place a fixture at the right spot, this task actually becomes quite easy because this fixture blocks any kind of wrong motion of this robot. And it almost acts like a funnel that restricts this motion, guides the robot towards a successful execution of this task. So in our work, we were wondering, can we autonomously discover how to ease manipulation skill learning through the optimal placement of this fixture? And the approach that we took here consists of an inner and an outer loop, where each run some version of reinforcement learning. And the outer loop really learns to place a physical fixture. So you see on the bottom left of this picture, the blue robot basically places this red fixture. And the other robot looks at the scene through the camera. And then basically the robot the blue robot tries to figure out, like, oh, how do I place the fixture so that it's good for this other robot? All right, so then we have an inner loop that basically controls this green robot now. And that one basically tries to learn in a fixed number of iteration how to achieve that task given the current fixture pose. And basically it has a certain success, or maybe it's not successful if the fixture is placed badly. So it receives a certain reward after a fixed number of iteration. And this reward is given back to the outer loop so that the outer loop gets some information about whether it has done well with the fixture placement or not. So the higher the reward achieved by the inner loop, the more reward the fixture pose receives in the outer loop. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of this approach. And we formulate the outer loop problem as a contextual bandit problem. And the goal here is to learn a good policy for choosing this fixture placement given the context. So we get a context, which is the steps image. We have all these actions of placing the fixture, and each of them basically gives us a reward, and we want to learn how high that is. So essentially, what we do in the outer loop is to learn a Q function or a QW that approximates the true Q function. And the true Q function basically outputs the expected reward after taking an action A. And the action A in our case is really displacement of the fixture. And the context or the state is a depth image, and it's processed by some convolutional neural network. So once we have this QW, we learned this at test time, we basically maximize over a set of actions, so different fixture position given the context, and therefore understand which action give us the highest expected reward. So that is pretty standard, but then the real challenge with this problem is how to learn this QW that basically approximates the true Q function. And the reason why this is challenging is because the true Q function is discontinuous. So let me explain. So here you have this visualization of a one-dimensional Q function where on the x-axis you have the fixture pose and on the y-axis the expected reward. And you see now how the reward looks like. If the fixture is accidentally covering the hole that the robot wants to insert a peg in, it will never be able to do that, right? So the expected reward is 0. But then suddenly, when the fixture is correctly aligned or best aligned with this hole, the reward goes to maximum. And if the fixture moves away a little bit from this, the reward goes slowly down. So this is a really difficult function to learn. So we proposed a new algorithm that we call a smooth zooming algorithm that we show is capable of learning this discontinuous function. And I'm not going to go into detail today into how this works, but feel free to check out the corresponding paper on this, or we can talk about it later if you're interested. Okay, so this is how we learn the Q function in the outer loop. And then the inner loop is honestly not super interesting how it works. It's basically just model-free RL, off the shelf. In this case, we used A3C. And given a fixture pose that is captured by an RGB image, we basically learn a good policy for this specific task. So what we wanted to understand is whether how exactly this fixture influences the inner loop learning. And what we found is actually that if the fixture is placed optimally, learning this particular skill is significantly faster. So this is something you see here in this plot. So basically on the y-axis of this plot, on the x-axis, you have the number of training iterations, and on the y-axis, you have the success rate. So you want this graph to grow as fast as possible. And if you have the fixture placed at the optimal position, you see that this orange line that corresponds to this grows, has basically steepest gradient, while using no fixture or a fixture at kind of like a suboptimal position doesn't really help at all. And it requires a lot of training iteration. So what I think is happening here is that this physical fixture really restricts the action space that needs to be explored by this RL method. And therefore learning is much faster. And we see similar results for the other manipulation tasks as well. All right, so putting it all together, we propose this inner outer loop structure. And basically what you have to keep in mind is the faster the inner loop learns, the higher the reward for the outer loop when it has placed this fixture in a certain way. And so for the outer loop, this is a visualization of this QW that it learns for fixture pose selection. So let me explain a little bit how this looks like. The outer loop is basically parameterized by a three-dimensional vector, x, y, and theta, that represents the horizontal translation and rotation in the plane, basically perpendicular to this hole. And this image on the top in green, it represents this QW function, where here the fixture is set to some, like UV position or XY position and -15 degrees orientation. And each pixel there corresponds to a position of the fixture in this fixed orientation. And the darker the color, the higher is the predicted reward. And you see that this darkest pixel here basically corresponds to the pose where the fixture is basically best aligned, at least for this particular orientation. And so this Q map really makes sense. It does rate those positions highest that have basically the best positioning, or at least have some constraining effect. And similarly for other orientations of this fixture, this QW looks very reasonable. So the outer loop really learns the right thing. So here's a video that I hope runs smoothly for you that shows how this looks on a real robot. So the first phase is basically this first robot trying to find the optimal fixture pose. And then we replay a learned policy on this inner loop robot. And you see, given this fixture pose, it actually succeeds. Here's another task that is a wrench task, where again, this robot holding the red object is searching for a good position, and then the inner loop robot can use this as a support to keep a good horizontal position. And here we have the third task that is basically a robot inserting a battery into your phone, into your mobile phone. And again, the robot first searches for a good fixture position, and then the other robot can nicely exploit that fixture to do this shallow depth insertion, as it is called. Yeah, so here's another cool thing about this work. We actually trained all of this in simulation, and then we directly test the resulting policy in the real world. And transferring skills on a robot from simulation to reality is a huge area of research, because it's a very hard problem, especially if contact is involved. But there are certain things that made it easier for us to actually transfer the skill, which is we're using depth images that typically transfer better to the real world, from sim to real. But also this fixture by itself, this entire concept by itself, funnels uncertainty that may also come from the sim to real gap. So this is actually why we think this works quite well. And also here, what I just showed you in this particular video, I'm just going to play it again, is that the same policy, when we play it with differently shaped pegs, the robot doesn't know that these are differently shaped, it still succeeds because this fixture pose funnels this uncertainty that also comes from this different shape. So just to summarize this particular work, where we basically transferred the principle of physical scaffolding from human learning to robots, is that the main idea is that we let one robot learn to alter the environment so that it scaffolds manipulation learning for the inner loop robot. And we also made an algorithmic contribution, which is introducing the smooth zooming algorithm for learning a discontinuous Q function. And what we end up with is a more robust manipulation system, and learning is sped up dramatically. So I discussed with you a bit this principle of physical scaffolding for human learning, or basically I gave you a few examples. And I also gave you an example from our lab's work on how this principle can be ported to robot manipulation skill learning. So this idea that humans are exploiting environmental constraints and that this could be useful for robots is rather new and actually a bit surprising. And the dominant approach was certainly more leaning towards motion planning that really avoids contact, but is not really useful, as I hope I convinced you of. So I now want to discuss a second principle of human learning. And this is the principle of learning from demonstration or imitation learning. And this idea is not new, especially not in robotics, and has been explored for many years. So here's a very important reference that I encourage you to read if you are interested, from 1999, on how this type of imitation learning can be ported to robots and actually be helpful. So imitation learning is really seen as an alternative to either manual programming or learning a skill from scratch. And there's a lot of work, and I'm not going to be able to review all of this for you here. I'm just going to give you some examples. So, for example, there have been many works that successfully use a technique called kinesthetic teaching for teaching skills. So here are two examples that I picked. On the left, you see Peter Pastor showing the robot how to grasp this flashlight by actually physically moving this arm in the right way, and then the robot can really reproduce this skill. And here's a video I found, honestly, just this morning, which I found pretty fun. So I thought it might also be fun for you. It's a video of a Swiss chef teaching a robot that is really crappy at raclette cheese cutting, how to do that in the right way. And you see, he's also using this technique called kinesthetic teaching, and shows the robot by applying the right forces and doing the right motion, by actually guiding the robot with this. So this is super useful. And, you know, if the robot would need to learn how to cut this or scrape off this cheese with reinforcement learning, there would be a lot, this would be a mess. I bet you can see that. So it's really nice to use this learning from demonstration because it doesn't require you to do reward engineering as you would need to do for reinforcement learning. And many people have discussed that this actually can be quite hard. But another limitation of this kinesthetic teaching is really, or even teleoperation for these tasks, is that it's potentially, or it's not really clear how to scale that up to the potentially many different tasks that you want a robot to do on the within like any kind of environment and with any kind of object, right? So is there a different way to provide supervision from this kinesthetic teaching or teleoperation mode? So it turns out that nowadays we have really great tools for actually processing videos. It's much better than a few years ago. So people have started to use video demonstrations to teach robots. And so here are two examples that I picked. This is one-shot imitation from observing humans via domain adaptive meta-learning. And you see the person here pushing this object, and the robot is supposed to reproduce the skill even if the environment changed a little bit. Or here's another example where, again, you have a person demonstrating in a video how to make a coffee, and the robot is supposed to imitate that one. Also, again, just by using videos. Okay, so this idea of just using videos has, of course, huge potential. If just think of the masses of videos online that teach you how to do all sorts of things. So if a robot could leverage these demonstrations, it could really learn a much more diverse set of skills by just watching videos. So this is really nice. Like if you don't require this kind of something that could be more I would say tedious to do, like this kinesthetic teaching. However, the number of tasks that a robot can currently learn, even with these kinds of video-based approaches, is still quite limited. And the possible variations of the environment seem small. And I think maybe one thing that could be the reason for this is that, or the reason why learning from videos is actually more challenging, is that you don't get directly this joint motion information that you would get from kinesthetic teaching. And so this might be one of the reasons why the video-based learning from demonstration approaches are still somewhat limited. So we are still asking, how can we scale up learning from demonstrations to these many diverse tasks? And I want to show you another work that we have done where we, again, try to step more towards this goal of having a robot just watch video demonstrations. So we really wanted to endow a robot with the ability to acquire a diverse set of manipulation concepts. And these manipulation concepts can be seen as mental representations of verbs in a sentence. So given an initial scene image here on the bottom left, when we send various instructions such as put something behind something or put something into something, we want our robot to generate motion trajectories that accomplish these tasks. So to achieve this goal, we construct an embedding space that associates task instructions and scene images with motion trajectories. And constructing an embedding space of manipulation concepts offers several benefits. So first, we can specify manipulation tasks with language instructions instead of with goal images. And describing the task, which is like goal images are another common approach right now to provide learning from demonstration. And describing the task with language is much simpler than providing a goal image as well. Second, we can obtain a multitask policy to represent diverse manipulation skills, such as open something or close something. And third, by training on a diverse set of manipulation tasks, our policy can actually generalize to novel but similar instructions. Okay, so how do we train the robot to output trajectories to accomplish multiple tasks? So again, like we also use learning from visual demonstrations, since we believe that's a way to actually scale this up. And because it allows us to avoid reward engineering or kinesthetic teaching or teleoperations, which are time consuming and difficult to scale up to a large number of tasks. So we use a data set called 20 billion something something of visual demonstration. It contains around 200K video clips that of which you see examples here on the left, with 174 different action classes. Each video clip is annotated with a task description, such as putting something on a surface or moving something up. So this is really a great data set for this. However, there are large domain gaps between human demonstrations and robot simulations. So this is, of course, also, that is always a problem for learning from demonstrations that are provided as video. And here's an example for this domain gap. So take close something as an example. On the left, you see 4 examples for closing something, but they're all quite different from the robot simulation on the right. And we need a learning from visual demonstration method that can handle all these different backgrounds, different viewpoints, different objects, and so on. So how do we bridge this domain gap? And our main idea here is to use a video action classifier to evaluate robot trajectories. So the video classifier that we use here is first trained to classify the action labels of each video clip in the 20 billion something something data set. And we use this learned classifier to also score robot videos. And the score represents how confident the video classifier estimates the robot video belongs to the corresponding action label. And we run a reinforcement learning algorithm to update the motion of the robot, where the reward is the score from the video classifier. So because the training examples for a given action are so visually diverse, our hypothesis is that a video action classifier would learn to capture the visual dynamics of the actions rather than the appearance of the environment. And if this is true, this would mean that the video action classifier could be used on our simulated environment as well, since the visual dynamics of the actions could be similar, even if the environment appears completely different. Okay, so the learning from demonstration pipeline works as follows. So first, we send language instructions and an initial scene image as the input to our model by concatenating their features to provide semantic context. And then a policy generation network outputs a motion trajectory specified as a goalpost and a series of forces that shape the otherwise straight line trajectory. And next, we execute the entire motion trajectory with the robot in simulation and render it to get a video. this video is sent to the action classifier to get a score, which we use as a reward. And we run a reinforcement learning algorithm to update the parameters of the motion trajectory to maximize the reward. So this is how the overall system looks like. And while the 20 billion something dataset contains 174 different action classes, we selected 78 tasks which are suitable for our robot simulation. And we set up a simulation environment in PyBullet. For each task, we train a policy using this pipeline that I just showed you. And here's the result of what comes out. This is an example for close something, this draw. And note that we test our policy with randomly generated initial object poses. So you see that this draw is actually moved around in the scene. So the robot has to adapt to that. Here's another task that is a bit more complex: tilt something with something on it so that it falls. And again, you see that the robot has to start from different starting configurations as well to achieve this task. Okay, so now with this pipeline, we have trained 78 single task experts, each of which outputs motion trajectories to accomplish one specific task. But what I mentioned, or what I talked about before, is that, of course, our ultimate goal is to construct a unified model to represent a diverse set of manipulation tasks. And we formulate this as a multitask learning problem. We train a multitask policy by running behavior cloning on the previously learned single task expert. And the result is a unified model that can take in various task instructions and scene images as input and output trajectories for 78 different tasks. So how does the result look like? Here are some examples of this multitask policy on a diverse set of tasks. So you really see these are quite different. And again, like all of these work on different initial positions of this object. Here's some more examples for this. Things like let something roll down a slanted surface. These are actually quite difficult tasks, and they are very varied. And here's one cool thing that we can also now do. Our multitask policy can also generalize to novel but similar instructions. So we can change these instructions that the policy was trained on and still achieve a reasonable output of the motion. Okay, so just to summarize this work, that was called Concept of Robot, Learning Manipulation Concepts from Instructions in Human Demonstrations. The main idea here was to learn to imitate humans using video activity classifiers to provide the reward. And we proposed a curriculum learning approach of multitask policies from instructions in form of natural language and video demonstrations. And as a result, we get a multitask policy that can execute 76 different tasks indexed by natural language instructions. Yeah, so just to wrap up this talk, I showed you these two example projects from my group that give you an example of how you can transfer principles in human learning to a robot and are actually quite successful in doing so. And the two concepts I was referring to was specifically physical scaffolding and learning from demonstrations. And again, like that humans exploit physical constraints is actually a fairly new insight that the robotics community just gets started on. And I showed you this work that uses this idea to learn how to alter the environment for better learning. And learning from demonstration or imitation learning is really a very well-known concept. But how to scale it up to many tasks and task variation is an open question. And I showed you an approach for a robot that can learn many tasks from video demonstrations that are actually annotated with natural language instructions. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. This is a picture of my awesome students in my lab, and I thank also all the funding sources.
All right. Thank you, Jeannette, for the wonderful talk. So let's just sort of jump into the questions. We could maybe start easy and then go into the kind of thornier issues that you raise.
Sure.
So the first question is sort of mine. You know, it struck me when you were talking about scaffolding, this example of learning how to ride a bike. You can increase your ability to do that quickly by using things like training wheels. And that's a very complicated task. The example you gave is by placing a fixture to put a peg into it. So it's sort of a two-part question. I realize you have an outer loop which controls, using reinforcement learning principles, how to put the fixture, and that's embodied by one robotic arm, and an inner loop that then conditioned on that puts the peg in, at least according to my understanding. Easy question. Can this all be implemented in one arm? Why do you need two? Does it mimic sort of the two arms?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So no, it doesn't really depend on the second arm. So you could also imagine there's a person there that moves it around, and it's just like kind of collecting data on how this fixture, each of these poses that this person went through is evaluated, and then you just place it there. So this second robot was more using our experimental setup, but it's also fun just to have two robots collaborating, but it's not like the fundamental, there's no fundamental requirement to have a second robot.
Understood. So in principle, it could all be manipulated onto sort of one manipulandium, essentially.
That's true. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. So then moving into sort of the harder territory, it's something that you just alluded to into sort of your conclusion. Inserting a peg into a square by learning how to manipulate the environment required you to do quite a bit of engineering. The task is quite constrained, and then you have to engineer the reward function. And so this is actually a question from the audience, which is, if a robot can autonomously modify its environment and discover how to sort of ease manipulation under these known and expected parameters, how can you generalize this to robots facing an unpredictable environment? And this question is quite good. He gives the example of an environment like a mine. The task is disaster rescue. How can you sort of logically further your research to this?
Yeah.
Very complicated.
I mean, I completely agree. So this is like a proof of concept work, right? Like this is I think, as far as I know, this is at least one of the first works probably that really shows how a robot can learn how to ease another robot's learning, right? So it's really a first type of work, and it's very constrained in the sense that, of course, we designed the fixtures, right? We know exactly, okay, this L-shaped thing works really well for this peg insertion or for the shallow depth insertion, right? This is a very specific fixture. And also the exploration space is limited, right? It's for this L-shaped, for example, it's 3-dimensional. And so the exploration is, of course, much easier in the space. So, okay, so how do you scale this up, right? This is a very good question, and we are working on this actually right now. The example of a mine or a disaster relief scenario is also quite interesting to me. It's very hard because you would have like completely weirdly shaped rocks or maybe broken off slats or whatever, right? And can a robot actually figure out how to use these to help in such a scenario, or maybe to transport stuff out? And we are just looking at this, and I think there is a lot of work to be done on just perception, right? Like, how do you even figure out how these objects are shaped? How do you kind of reconstruct this? And I'm thinking these are just like some ideas that we're really just working on this. Like one way you could think about it is to find local structures or kind of local shapes that these objects you basically find in an unconstrained environment have, that have certain properties that help you to constrain the motion of some other object that you might want to move, right? So you could try to find those kind of local structures and then place them in the right way. So that is one way, and that is kind of inspired by work in grasping and manipulation, where often people take the approach of finding local structures in, for example, a pile of objects that looks great for grasping, right? And so taking that idea into this more unconstrained environments for altering the environment could be an interesting direction.
Yeah, in general.
Another way is maybe to just also something we haven't explored is to alter the fixture, right? Like for these tasks, again, like our intuition has given us the ability to design this fixture. And I'm wondering, like, can you maybe backpropagate to the shape of these objects as well to actually not only change the pose, but also the shape? So this is another interesting area to look at.
That's so interesting. In general, I love the framing of make life easier by imposing real world constraints on yourself to sort of learn a task, which sort of makes me want to transition maybe more towards the second half of your talk. So in the first half of your talk, the main principles you were using were reinforcement learning, and in the second one, it was more imitation learning. And I wonder if you can sort of marry the two, and again, in the context of this disaster mine rescue, like, might it be possible to apply the principles you were just talking about in that context to generalize the first part of the work on scaffolding to perhaps watching videos of people doing these actions? Is there a way to combine these two principles?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this would be super interesting to see. Yeah, so to be honest, like one thing with the second work that I'm actually not quite sure about is like, what exactly does this action classifier pick up, right? That informs the robot to do the same task. And I think there are actually very interesting data sets out there. For example, Epic Kitchen comes to mind, which is massive and just has these egocentric video of people doing tasks in the kitchen, anything like from dishwashing, preparing food, and stuff like this. And with 100% uncertainty, people are exactly using these strategies that Julia Child has also shown with the potato cutting, right? And so it would be great to see if we can somehow learn these strategies that people do to encourage the robot to do the same. And because we know it helps a robot as it helps a person to become more robust. So for that, I would love to have more introspection, right, in these video classifiers maybe. Or maybe see how do the human hand, how does the human hand, for example, move with respect to the different objects that they're manipulating in the environment? What are the relative trajectories that they do? Are there failures that happen? How do they recover from failures? So I don't really yet know how to bridge these, but I think the first thing I would love to do is to just analyze the strategies that people have. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's two threads I kind of want to take that in, just out of sheer curiosity. So you mentioned, let's do the easier one first. So you mentioned, well, let me sort of gather my thoughts here. So there are numerous methods for trying to interpret a model for what features it's using in the context of simple tasks like object classification. Here, it's really interesting. You have this activity net, it's learning features. The features aren't necessarily for doing object detection. They're for this much higher order goal-directed movement. Do any of these existing algorithms for like aiding in interpretability help you in this context? Is there a need to kind of work on new ways of interpreting these models to understand what it is that they're learning about from the humans that allows them to perform well? How should I think about it?
Yeah, it's again, it's like a good question, and honestly, we're again like just starting to look into this because this is both of these are very new works, but I'm basically also aware of these introspective works that you said, like where you can somehow, for example, visualize. I've also know a lot of work that tries to do audio localization, or for example, locate where's a certain audio source in an image. And I've seen how basically the location in the image is highlighted and how that is possible. But yeah, I'm not sure how you can basically uncover temporal relations, because that's really what's going on here, right? So for example, I haven't shown these results, but in this last work, we have a comparison in the experiments where we compare the performance of this imitation learning method by just classifying one of the final images of these tasks, right? Of just saying like, okay, here's the goal state that you should reach. And we basically classify the final image that the robot reaches to provide it information on how to do the entire trajectory. But it turns out that for some tasks, this is sufficient. But for many tasks, it's actually important to see the entire sequence of the demonstration or the entire video of whatever the person has done. For example, when you pour something, you need to understand that you actually have to reorient that object. When you just place something somewhere else, that doesn't really matter so much. You're fine with the final image. And now how to uncover these or how to visualize what the network has actually picked up for the activity classification in an entire video. I don't know how to do that. And if anyone knows, please write me an email or give me some pointers. I would love to read that to see this work. Yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea how to even start. So then backing up, the other direction I wanted to kind of push further on is that when I think about, one thing you said is you'd love to study more about how humans are sort of solving these problems to better inform the development of algorithms. One key difference, at least from what I can glean from your talk, is that so much of our human ability to reach and grasp is predicated on haptics, tactile touch. Like we have so many more sensory inputs. We can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can feel. And these are not things as of yet, you tell me, you're the expert, that the robotic arms that you use in the laboratory can necessarily do, but they strike me as potentially really interesting intrinsic signals one can use to solve these interesting problems like disaster rescue in a mine. How are you thinking about pushing your work further in that direction, if at all, to take into account multimodal data?
Yes, so this is like one of that I haven't talked about at all today, but yeah, exploiting multimodal data is absolutely necessary, especially, I think in general for robotics, but especially in manipulation. I think even in autonomous driving, which I'm not an expert in, using, for example, RGB and LiDAR data is very beneficial for object detection or for tracking and things like that, right? So, but for manipulation, as you said, the sense of touch is extremely important. And we have had work, I actually worked on this, already 10 years ago, I worked on fusing vision and touch. It's been a journey. So I feel nowadays, all the advancements that have been made in processing actual visual data, or in general processing raw sensory data using deep networks with lots of data, for example, have enabled robotics researcher also to make much more progress towards the goal they have worked on already for so many years, right? So, for example, one thing that we have worked on is how to look at representation learning for the case when you have not only visual data, but also data from, for example, force torque sensors. So a sensor that actually measures how many forces you apply to the environment and how much torque is acting on your end effector. And we wanted to fuse this information because we know it's important for manipulation. Yeah. The vision sensor has only so much resolution, and for very tight tolerance tasks, you just don't have enough information to do it. So you really need that haptic information. But the problem with that kind of data, or the challenge, let's say the challenge with that kind of data, is that it comes at a kilohertz at you, and it's 6-dimensional, continuously evolves. It's incredibly noisy. The sensor drifts. And once you make contact, you get the spike in the data. And this is very different from visual data, where you have like, okay, it's 30 hertz. It's like, coming at you at 33 milliseconds each. That's fine, right? You can deal with that. You have this very structured data. It's discrete. And so it's very different. And it's not very clear how to fuse this information. Mm-hmm. And also, so what we basically have done is to propose this new representation learning method that is also self-supervised, so that you, one challenge in robotics is of course to collect a lot of data, which is less problematic in other fields, because you always have this robot that actually has to make decision without killing, without breaking itself or hurting any person or destroying the environment, right? So we also proposed a self-supervised way to train this representation, and then we showed that first of all, multiple modalities are important, especially touch, in addition to vision, and we showed that self-supervised tasks that are predictive are important rather than reconstruction. I think this unsupervised representation learning is much more common, right? But in robotics, it actually helps for the robot to predict forward what is going to happen. And another thing we showed is that variational autoencoders are actually better than vanilla autoencoders. We don't really understand, we have some hypotheses, but we don't really understand why that is. But in any case, we then used that representation and did reinforcement learning on top of it or with it. And we showed that then you can learn this task also fairly quickly, and especially quicker than if you only use vision.
I see. So when you're talking about learning the representation, are you talking about jointly learning a representation for both the vision data and the haptic data, or just for the haptic data itself?
We learn it we learn it jointly because we think there is this there's this complementary information, and there's also concurrency, right? Because if you have that you want to exploit, because if visually you're close to an object, you may or may not be in contact. You only see that in the contact information, really. So that sensor information really should put you in a completely different space, or in a completely different location in your lower dimensional latent space. So it was really important for us to fuse that, to learn that jointly. Wow. The representation.
It's so different than when I was learning in electrical engineering control theory for robotics. So much has changed, I think.
Yeah, I think these things are still important, right? So I think what you have learned, I'm going to make like a guess here, is that control theory was a completely observable state.
Yes.
Right? Where you just assume you have that state and it's like, perfect. But of course, that's not the case. Like even if you do have joint sensing and you want to control only that, your robot is going to have noise and errors and biases and all of this. So yeah, and now on top of this, we have all this raw sensory data that makes the state partially observable, which makes everything much harder.
Right.
Yeah.
So piggybacking off of that last sentiment, like thinking back to things like ImageNet, right? So here, the thing that really fueled progress in computer vision research was like a well-defined task with a large amount of data. You can make sort of similar claims about progress in NLP with, at least benchmarks like glue and superglue and, all of these things. How does this work in robotics? Because it strikes me that these might be more difficult tasks to write down and generate coherent data sets for. How does the field think about that? Are you rallying around sort of an ImageNet type of moment? If not, why? How does it all?
No. So yeah, it's a very complicated topic, and it comes up at every robotics conference. You have these workshops, and then you have the panel at the end, and then the panel with 90% probability is going to end up talking about benchmarking and having these two sides of people like, yeah, we need benchmark. And then the other people is like, no, it's too hard. We don't need those. And I think there are pros and cons to benchmarks. And I mean, ImageNet was absolutely, as you said, like one of the driving components towards all this progress, by just having this data available and a very well-defined task. But the problem, there are multiple differences in robotics that don't make this so easily applicable. And also there are actually a lot of data sets in robotics,
Mhm.
but they are not as widely used, except for maybe in driving, right? Autonomous driving has some data sets, but again, these are mostly vision data
Yeah.
sets. So what you have in robotics is, first of all, so many different tasks, right? So I just talked today about manipulation, but there are like swimming robots, crawling robots,
Right.
walking robots, whatever robots, right? All sorts of shapes also. Even manipulation robots come in so many different embodiments. It is as if you have a million different cameras that have like a completely different, I don't know, style of sensory data, or give you different information depending on how you move it around or something. I don't know what the analogy would be, but it's just extremely varied what you have in robotics, even just talking about manipulation. So if you wanted to reproduce someone's work on your robot, it would take you a lot of time. And it's not necessarily required or rewarded to do that in the robotics
Right.
community.
Right.
It's a bit different, right? You don't have to test on 5 different data sets because, first of all, they don't exist, and secondly, it would mean you have to make it work on your own robot. And yeah, it's not enforced in the reviews, and I don't think it's even really possible. But I think the biggest difference to vision is that you have a closed loop system, right? Where your decision changes the data within the next millisecond. And that means that you cannot just have an offline data set,
Yeah.
right? So I think I said this before, like I think the ImageNet of robotics, it's either going to be a simulator, which has its own problem, right? Because it doesn't transfer, at least so well, or it's going to be a challenge or some kind of test site or something like this, right? Where you actually have teams competing maybe on the same platform with different approaches in the same environments, right? But even with that, you have all these problems of the limited domain, where you often can solve or win this particular domain by exploiting the bounded domain, right? And the properties of it. So it seems, again, like not super useful sometimes, although I have to say, of course, the grand challenge, right, was extremely useful to see. Autonomous driving to see where we are. The same with the DRC. It was extremely useful to see, like, oh, maybe humanoid robots are not yet there. Or yeah, I mean, there are definitely challenges and they bring some useful information, but they also have their problems. So it's just much harder to even agree on a task, to agree on a data set, because you have a closed loop system. It's a very difficult topic.
Okay, yeah, no, it's so fascinating the way you articulate the difference between vision, because the data can be changing based on how the perceiving arm or whatever is interacting with the environment. So very difficult to standardize unless it's through simulation. So
and actually one more point is, like, the cool thing is, though, that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because by having the robot change the environment, it can even get more information just by interacting with it and make perception or the task, for example, easier, which is cool.
Yeah, which is also, exactly. It's pros and cons. So there's 1 minute left. Let's try to sneak in one last question from the audience, if that's okay. So, you mentioned in your talk that you trained all of your robots in simulation, at least in the first part, and then tested in the real world. And so a question from the audience is, could you speak towards something about the potential of cloud robotics to make it possible for other robots, perhaps far away, to gain the kinds of skills that they need to perform their functions when they're learned by sort of one robot? And how similar would these sets of robots need to be, the one that's trained on and the one that's learning from the other one?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So yeah, so first of all, I think data is very important also in robotics. It's just harder somewhat to come about. So the idea of cloud robotics, that you have robots collecting I guess, experience and then uploading it to the cloud so that other robots can use it is very appealing. And there are multiple people who have been looking at this. I think the first one was maybe Saxena or it's like I'm not remembering the name right now. But yeah, there are multiple groups actually following that idea. One problem with that is, again, this adaptation, right? The same, you have a domain gap between simulation and the real world, but you also have a domain gap between an embodiment of one robot and the embodiment of the other robot. But I think we can have some ways to think about that. So one way is maybe through the way that I talked about in that second project, where you train an activity classifier maybe on one robot or a person, and then you use that to provide the reward to a robot with a completely different embodiment than the person or the other robot. So that worked surprisingly well. And I think it's because we took this video into account, right? Where the dynamics matter, not the appearance. So that's one way to think about it.
Is that a counterintuitive finding? It strikes me as
it was a little surprising that we have this huge domain gap, and yet that activity classifier can actually steer the robot towards the right thing. It doesn't work, like we have 78 or something tasks, and it doesn't work well for all of them, but for many of them it works really well.
Wow.
Which was definitely surprising. So but that tells me that there is quite some promise actually on using these classifiers to provide the reward.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we've done is, when you have a robot, you know everything about it. You know the kinematics, you know the geometry of it, you have everything. So that means you can actually use that as an input. So what if you had one robot uploading stuff, data and experience to the cloud, and then you have a different robot pulling that to learn from it, but it has a different embodiment, but it knows its embodiment, so it could potentially use that as input and condition on that embodiment as well. Yeah. I don't think we have to be agnostic to it. We could just be aware of it. And we have some work as well on this for grasping, actually, where we do that with robot hands that are also extremely different sometimes.
Okay, well, I could keep talking about this all day, but I think we're out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for the stimulating talk and the conversations.
Thank you.
And it was just a pleasure to have you. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you here again next week at the same time. So yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you, Deep. It was fun talking to you, and thank you for all the questions.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.